The rain didn't just fall, it hammered against the city, a relentless percussion that mirrored the turmoil inside Lila Marston. She sat in room 306 of the Blue Moon Motel, staring at the revolver on the table. Her makeup was smudged, her hair unkempt, and her hands shook as she lit her last cigarette from a nearly empty pack. Outside, thunder rolled. The neon light of the motel's flickering vacancy sign bathed the room in intermittent flashes of pink and blue. The phone rang. Lila hesitated, her trembling fingers hovering above the receiver. She finally picked it up. Lila! Detective Jack Calloway's gravelly voice came through the line, steady but edged with urgency. I know what you're thinking. Don't do it. We can fix this. Her voice cracked as she replied. Fix what, Jack? He took everything. My life, my children, my dignity. And now I'm the one left standing in the rain with nothing. You're better than this, Jack said. You're not a killer. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. Aren't I? Maybe I always was, and he just brought it out in me. The line went dead. Detective Jack Calloway didn't advertise. His office, tucked away in a decrepit downtown LA building, survived on word of mouth and reputation. Jack wasn't flashy. He wasn't polite. But he got results, and that's why Lila Marston found herself sitting in his cramped, smoky office 2 weeks earlier. The room smelled of stale whiskey and old coffee. A fan spun lazily overhead, doing nothing to combat the heat. The blinds were drawn, casting slatted shadows across the mismatched furniture and cluttered desk. Lila sat across from Jack, her polished exterior clashing with the dingy surroundings. She was a woman of contradictions, elegant yet frayed, confident yet desperate. My husband is trying to destroy me, she began, lighting a cigarette with a practiced hand. Jack studied her through the haze of smoke, his piercing blue eyes unreadable. You're gonna have to give me more than that, lady. She launched into her story. Charles Marston was a man of power, charm, and ruthlessness. A successful attorney with a reputation for winning impossible cases, he had also perfected the art of control in his personal life. 2 years ago, he began an affair with his secretary, Vanessa, a blonde bombshell with a calculating mind. When Lila confronted him, Charles turned vindictive. He filed for divorce, froze their accounts, and manipulated their children, Chloe and Max, into thinking their mother was unstable. I gave him 20 years, Lila said, her voice trembling. I supported his career, raised our kids, and now he's leaving me with nothing but the ashes. Jack leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming on the desk. And you think he's hiding something? I know he is, Lila said firmly. He's been moving money into offshore accounts. And there's something else, something from years ago. I don't have proof, but I heard him mention it once. It sounded bad. Jack's instincts kicked in. This wasn't just another scorned spouse looking for payback. There was more to this story, and he intended to find out what. Jack's first step was to dig into Charles's financials. He spent days poring over court filings, business records, and bank statements. On the surface, Charles's finances were pristine. But Jack had connections, old friends who owed him favors. Through a backdoor at a local bank, Jack discovered a series of suspicious wire transfers to accounts in the Cayman Islands. The amounts were staggering, far more than a high-powered attorney would need to squirrel away for a divorce. Jack brought this information to Lila at a quiet cafe in the valley. The two sat in a corner booth, away from prying eyes. He's hiding millions offshore, Jack said, sliding a folder across the table. But that's not the kicker. These transfers started 15 years ago, right after a hit-and-run case he defended mysteriously disappeared from the system. Lila's face paled. Hit-and-run? Jack nodded. The victim was a waitress named Clara Donnelly. She was killed crossing a street late at night. Witnesses described the car as a black luxury sedan, but the case went cold. I think Charles was behind the wheel, and he paid to cover it up. Lila's life at home had become a battlefield. Chloe, Her 18-year-old daughter refused to speak to her, siding with Charles. Max, 14, was caught in the middle, torn between loyalty to his mother and fear of his father. One evening, Lila returned home to find Charles sitting in the living room, a glass of bourbon in hand. "This isn't your house anymore," he said, his voice calm but dripping with malice. "You're only here because I allow it. Don't forget that." Lila stood her ground. "You're a liar and a cheat, Charles. And I'm going to prove it." He smirked. "You're out of your depth, darling. Go ahead and try. You'll only embarrass yourself." That night, Lila cried herself to sleep in the guest room, clutching a photograph of her children. Detective Jack Calloway was no stranger to dealing with mistresses. Most of them were as clueless as they were opportunistic. But Vanessa Cole was different. She was sharp, poised, and, as Jack quickly realized, just as ruthless as Charles Marston. Jack found her at a high-end salon in Beverly Hills. The place reeked of money and privilege. Vanessa was reclined in a plush chair, a glass of champagne in hand as a stylist worked on her platinum blonde waves. "Ms. Cole," Jack said, flashing his badge. "Got a minute?" Vanessa barely glanced at him. "Detective, I'm not in the habit of speaking to strange men during my personal time." Jack leaned against the counter unfazed. "I'm investigating Charles Marston. Thought you might have some insight." That got her attention. She dismissed the stylist with a wave and turned to face him. "What's this about?" she asked, her tone icy. "Offshore accounts, missing money, and a hit-and-run case from 15 years ago," Jack replied casually. "Ring any bells?" Vanessa's eyes narrowed. "I have no idea what you're talking about." Jack smirked. "Of course you don't. But here's the thing, if you're as smart as you seem, you'll want to think about what happens if Charles goes down. He won't protect you. He'll hang you out to dry." Vanessa's mask cracked for a split second, a flicker of fear, but she recovered quickly. "You're wasting your time, detective. Charles is untouchable." "We'll see," Jack said, tipping his hat as he left. Lila couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. For days, she noticed the same black sedan parked down the street from her house. Once, while shopping, she caught a glimpse of a man in a suit trailing her through the aisles. She called Jack, her voice trembling. "I think Charles has someone following me." Jack wasn't surprised. "He's playing defense. He knows we're closing in." Jack's instincts told him to dig deeper, and his hunch paid off. Late one night, he tailed the black sedan, following it to an upscale hotel downtown. The driver met with Charles in the lobby, exchanging a thick envelope before disappearing into the night. Jack snapped photos from a distance, his gut telling him this was bigger than just a divorce case. Determined to uncover the truth about the hit-and-run, Jack tracked down Clara Donnelly's younger brother, Ben. Now in his 30s, Ben was a bartender in a rundown joint on the outskirts of town. Ben was initially reluctant to talk, his pain still raw after all these years. But after a few drinks and Jack's promise to seek justice, he opened up. "My sister was everything to me," Ben said, his voice thick with emotion. "She was working 2 jobs to put me through school. The night she died, she was walking home because her car broke down. Witnesses said the guy who hit her didn't even slow down." Jack showed Ben a photo of Charles Marston. Ben's face darkened. "That's him. I'm sure of it. He used to come into the diner where Clara worked. Always acted like he was better than everyone else." Jack's suspicions were confirmed. Charles hadn't just committed a hit-and-run, he'd killed a woman he knew. Armed with the evidence, Jack and Lila confronted Charles at his law office late one evening. The office was dark, save for the glow of the city lights filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Charles greeted them with a smirk. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Lila stepped forward, her voice steady. "We know about the offshore accounts. And we know about Clara Donnelly." Charles's expression darkened. "You have no idea what you're talking about." Jack placed a folder on the desk. We've got bank records, witness statements, and enough to reopen the hit-and-run case. The only question is whether you want to cooperate or go down swinging." For the first time, Charles looked rattled. But he quickly recovered, leaning back in his chair. "You think you've got me? You don't know who you're dealing with. I have friends in high places." Lila's voice broke through the tension. "You're a monster, Charles. And I'm not afraid of you anymore." Charles wasn't bluffing about his connections. The next day, Jack's office was raided by Internal Affairs on trumped-up charges. His files were confiscated, and he was suspended indefinitely. Lila's situation worsened as well. Her accounts were frozen, her car was repossessed, and threatening letters began arriving at her doorstep. Desperate and out of options, Lila made a fateful decision. She broke into Charles's penthouse, intending to confront him one last time. What happened next would change everything. The penthouse was quiet, eerily so, as Lila stepped inside. She had used the spare key Charles hadn't thought to retrieve after the separation. The opulence of the place was overwhelming: marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and an expansive view of the city skyline. Charles was in his study, a glass of scotch in one hand and a cigar in the other, reviewing papers. He didn't look up as she entered. "Lila," he said casually, as though they were still married, "you're trespassing. Again." She placed a folder on the desk. "This ends tonight, Charles. You're going to sign over a fair settlement, confess to Claire's murder, and let me walk away with what's left of my life." Charles laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "You've been watching too many courtroom dramas. That's not how this works." Lila pulled a revolver from her bag and aimed it at him. The room went silent, save for the faint hum of the city below. Charles's expression shifted from amusement to disbelief. "You're not serious." "Try me," Lila said, her hands trembling but her eyes steady. Charles stood slowly, raising his hands. "You think this will fix anything? You'll go to prison, Lila." "And for what?" "You'll still lose." Lila's voice cracked as she replied, "I've already lost everything because of you." The argument escalated, voices raised, accusations flying. In the chaos, Charles lunged for the gun. A struggle ensued, and a single shot rang out. Charles fell to the floor, blood pooling beneath him. Lila dropped the gun, staring in horror at what she had done. Jack was sitting in his car, nursing a flask of bourbon, when his phone rang. It was Lila. "Jack," she said, her voice shaking. I think I've killed him." Jack arrived at the penthouse within minutes, his mind racing. He found Lila sitting on the floor, her hands stained with blood, and Charles's lifeless body slumped over the desk. "Tell me exactly what happened," Jack said, kneeling beside her. "He came at me," she whispered. "I didn't mean to, it just happened so fast." Jack inspected the scene. The gun was Charles's, registered in his name. The struggle was evident: overturned chairs, papers scattered across the room. But Jack knew the police wouldn't care. All they would see was a scorned wife who snapped. "We need to call this in," Jack said. "No," Lila begged. "Please, Jack. Help me. I can't go to prison." Against his better judgment, Jack decided to help her. He wiped down the gun, placing it back in Charles's hand to stage it as a suicide. He gathered the documents scattered on the desk, knowing they might contain incriminating evidence. Before leaving, Jack made sure there was no trace of Lila's presence. "You need to lay low," he told her. "Go to a motel and don't talk to anyone." Lila nodded, tears streaming down her face. The next day, news of Charles Marston's death was all over the headlines. The police ruled it a suicide, but Jack knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. Charles had too many enemies, and someone was bound to dig deeper. Jack began piecing together the documents he had taken from the penthouse. Among them was a ledger detailing years of bribes, payoffs, and illegal dealings. It was enough to implicate half the city's elite, and to explain why Charles had been so confident in his untouchability. But there was a problem. Lila's name appeared in the files. Charles had been funneling money into an account in her name, making it look like she was complicit in his schemes. Despite Jack's efforts, the police found inconsistencies in the suicide narrative. Ballistics didn't match up, and a witness came forward claiming to have seen a woman leaving the building that night. Lila was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. Jack visited her in jail, guilt eating away at him. "I'm sorry," he said. "I tried to protect you." Lila's eyes were hollow. "It doesn't matter anymore. They've already made up their minds." The trial was a media circus. The prosecution painted Lila as a manipulative woman who killed her husband out of greed and revenge. The defense argued self-defense, but without Jack's testimony, their case was weak. Jack wrestled with his conscience. Coming forward would mean implicating himself, but staying silent meant abandoning Lila. In the end, the jury convicted her of manslaughter. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Jack visited Lila one last time before her transfer to a state prison. "I found something," he said, sliding a copy of the ledger across the table. "This proves Charles was setting you up. I'm going to expose him, and everyone he worked with." Lila looked at him with a faint glimmer of hope. "Do you think it will make a difference?" Jack hesitated. "I don't know. But it's all I can do." As he left the prison, the rain began to fall, washing over the city like a baptism. Jack lit a cigarette and stared at the skyline, knowing that in a place like this, justice was always messy and rarely clean.